Sarah Mitchell's alarm clock read 5:47 a.m. when she jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat and gasping for air. Again. The nightmare had gripped her with the same suffocating intensity it always did, Emma screaming, her small voice piercing through darkness, calling out, "Mommy, Mommy, where are you?" But no matter how desperately Sarah ran, no matter how hard she pushed her legs forward, the distance between them never closed. Emma's terrified face grew smaller and smaller, disappearing into shadows while David's sinister laugh echoed from unseen corners. Sarah woke just as his hands reached for her daughter, every single night. The same horror, the same helplessness, the same crushing guilt that she couldn't protect her own child. She stumbled to the bathroom, her legs unsteady, her heart still racing like a trapped animal. The bathroom mirror showed her a stranger. The woman staring back wasn't the Sarah Mitchell everyone had known before the divorce, the one with bright eyes, clear skin, and an easy smile. This Sarah was haunted. Her eyes had sunken so deeply into her skull they looked like dark wells of despair. Her cheekbones protruded sharply beneath pale, papery skin. Her hair, once thick and lustrous auburn, hung in dull, limp strands around her face. She'd lost 23 pounds, not intentionally. Her body had simply forgotten how to want food when her mind was consumed with terror. Sarah gripped the cold porcelain sink and stared at her reflection with something approaching horror. How had everything spiraled so completely out of control? 3 years ago, her life had been normal, happy, even. She and David had been married for 8 years. They'd bought a beautiful home in a quiet Portland neighborhood. They'd planned for children. Emma had been born on a golden August morning, and Sarah remembered holding her daughter for the first time, thinking she'd experienced the most profound love humanly possible. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, David had changed. The charming man she'd married had revealed a darker core, controlling, manipulative, prone to explosive rages over minor infractions. When Sarah finally gathered the courage to leave him, she'd naively believed the worst was behind her. She was wrong, dead wrong. What followed was 18 months of psychological warfare orchestrated with terrifying precision. David's lawyer, a shark named Richard who specialized in custody disputes, had systematically dismantled Sarah's credibility piece by piece. They'd hired a private investigator who'd followed her for months, documenting her therapy sessions and presenting them as evidence of mental instability. David had somehow obtained, through means Sarah still didn't understand, a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation claiming she suffered from borderline personality disorder and was prone to erratic and dangerous behavior. The document was professionally forged, complete with a fake doctor's signature and official letterhead. Her own lawyer said proving it was forged would take weeks and thousands of dollars. The worst part, 18 months ago, a judge had granted David temporary custody of Emma, pending the outcome of the custody evaluation. Those had been the words that destroyed Sarah's world. Temporary, as if Sarah's daily existence without her daughter wasn't permanent agony, as if the court understood that every day without Emma felt like an eternity. She now got to see her daughter for 8 hours every other Saturday and Sunday. 8 hours every 14 days to be a mother to the most important person in her life. 8 hours to pretend everything was normal while inside she was screaming. Sarah had documented everything, every bruise, every strange comment Emma made, every time her daughter flinched when David's voice got loud. She kept journals filled with observations, screenshots of concerning text messages from David, notes from Emma's preschool teacher who'd mentioned the child seemed anxious and withdrawn. But her lawyer had warned her yesterday, his face grave and apologetic, that judges didn't always believe mothers in custody disputes. They see it as bias, he'd explained. Mothers fighting to get their children back will say anything. The courts know this. You need more than circumstantial evidence. You need something undeniable. Today was that hearing. Today, Judge Harold would make his decision about Emma's future. Sarah had barely slept in 3 days. When she did manage to close her eyes, the nightmares attacked with vicious regularity. Her therapist had prescribed sleep medication, but Sarah was terrified of taking it. What if something happened to Emma? What if David called her in the middle of the night? What if her daughter needed her? Sarah couldn't risk being medicated and unreachable. So instead, she lay in bed hour after hour, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning through worst-case scenarios with the relentless precision of a torture machine. She looked at the clock on the bathroom wall, 6:15 a.m. She had 4 hours and 45 minutes before she had to be in Judge's courtroom. 4 hours and 45 minutes to compose herself, to stop shaking, to look like a stable, capable mother instead of the broken shell she'd become. Sarah splashed cold water on her face and tried to steady her breathing. In through her nose, hold for 4 counts, out through her mouth. Her therapist had taught her this technique. It helped a little. Back in her bedroom, Sarah pulled out the pink dress she'd chosen for Emma, the one with the white lace collar that made her daughter look like a tiny princess. Sarah had bought it months ago, before everything fell apart, when she'd imagined dressing Emma for special occasions. The dress still had the tags attached. She'd been saving it, but for what? For a day like today. For a day when a 3-year-old girl would be paraded before a judge like a piece of property to be up in a divorce settlement. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, the dress cradled in her lap, and allowed herself to cry. Great, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in her soul. She cried for the life she'd lost. She cried for the time she'd missed with Emma, every milestone, every first word, every small achievement that belonged to a daughter who didn't understand why mommy wasn't there every day. She cried for the injustice of a system that seemed rigged against her, that seemed willing to believe a liar's fabricated documents over a mother's desperate love. She cried until there were no tears left, until her body was empty of everything except exhaustion and dread. When the tears finally stopped, Sarah whispered the prayer that had become her constant companion. Please, God, please let the judge see the truth. Please let me keep my baby. I don't know how much longer I can survive this. She didn't know that a miracle was already in motion. She didn't know that blocks away, in a police station, a 12-year veteran detective was reading her case file. She didn't know that a German shepherd named Duke was stretching his powerful muscles, preparing for a day that would change everything. She didn't know that sometimes salvation arrives in the most unexpected forms, and that today, in a few hours, the universe would finally tip in her favor. Sarah just knew she had to survive one more day, one more hearing, one more chance to fight for her daughter. She placed the pink dress carefully on the bed beside her and waited for dawn. The courtroom was suffocating in its formality and cold indifference. Sarah sat rigidly in the hard wooden chair, her fingers twisted together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Emma sat beside her, swinging her small legs nervously, her patent leather shoes clicking against the metal chair frame in an irregular rhythm that grated on Sarah's already frayed nerves. Across the aisle sat David, looking impeccable in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire monthly rent. His lawyer, Richard, sat beside him, a man with slick-back hair and a predatory smile that had haunted Sarah's nightmares for months. The gallery behind them was nearly empty. Sarah's mother had wanted to come but couldn't afford to take time off work. 2 of Sarah's friends sat in the back row, their presence a fragile thread of support in this hostile environment. David's family occupied the other side, his mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue, his father looking stern and judgmental. No one had come to support the truth. No one had come to stand beside a mother fighting for her child. Judge Harold sat elevated on his bench like a god above mortals, reviewing documents with an expression of profound disinterest. He was in his 60s, with gray hair, reading glasses perched on his nose, and a demeanor that suggested he'd seen 1,000 custody battles and had grown numb to the human tragedy unfolding before him. Sarah had researched him obsessively. He had a reputation for favoring fathers in custody disputes, believing that mothers often weaponized children against ex-partners out of spite. That fact had sent Sarah into a tailspin of despair when her lawyer had mentioned it. The proceedings had been brutal, had presented his fabricated evidence, the forged psychiatric evaluation, the private investigator's photos of Sarah entering a therapist's office, presented as evidence of mental illness rather than healing, testimony from a so-called character witness, who claimed Sarah had made inappropriate comments about her ex-husband in public. Every lie was wrapped in legal language and presented with such confidence that even Sarah had found herself questioning her own sanity. Was she actually unstable? Had she imagined Emma's bruises? Was she truly the villain in this story? Sarah's lawyer had done his best, but he was outmatched. They didn't have the resources that David's corporate litigation team had. They didn't have private investigators or expert witnesses on retainer. They had documentation and desperation, but the judge's expression suggested neither was enough. "The court is prepared to issue its preliminary ruling," Judge said, his voice carrying the weight of a guillotine blade. He opened the thick folder before him, and Sarah felt her heart literally stop beating. This was it. This was the moment that would determine the trajectory of her entire life and her daughter's future. But then something extraordinary happened. Sarah's attorney suddenly stood up with such abruptness that his chair scraped loudly against the polished courtroom floor. "Your Honor, I request an emergency recess. There is a matter of critical importance that has just come to light." The judge frowned, clearly annoyed at this interruption to his predetermined judgment. "Counsel, we've concluded this hearing. I'm about to." "Your Honor, this pertains directly to the minor," Sarah's attorney interrupted, his voice steady and commanding. "I respectfully insist on this brief recess." Something in his tone must have struck the judge as genuine concern rather than courtroom theatrics. Judge sighed heavily and looked at his watch. "Fine, we'll take a 15-minute recess, but counsel, this better be relevant." Sarah had no idea what was happening. She looked at her attorney frantically, but he just shook his head almost imperceptibly and mouthed, "Trust me." Those two words were supposed to be comforting, but they terrified her. 15 minutes later, the courtroom doors swung open with dramatic finality. Detective James walked through those doors with the measured stride of someone who'd spent 30 years commanding respect through presence alone. He was a tall man, African-American, with deep-set, intelligent eyes and silver threading through his close-cropped hair. But everyone's attention was immediately drawn to his companion, a magnificent German shepherd with a gleaming black and tan coat, moving with the grace and power of a predator. The dog's name was Duke, and he was about to become the most important witness in this courtroom. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. "This is absolutely preposterous," Richard roared, shooting to his feet so violently his chair clattered backward. "Your Honor, this is a circus, an absolute mockery of the judicial process. What in God's name is a police dog doing in my client's custody hearing?" David's face had turned an alarming shade of red. His mother clutched her purse, her eyes wide with confusion and anger. But it was Judge's reaction that mattered most. The judge looked genuinely intrigued, his disinterest from moments before replaced by something approximating cautious curiosity. "Order," the judge commanded, his gavel striking the bench once with authoritative finality. Everyone fell silent. Judge studied Detective over his reading glasses. "Detective, I assume there's an explanation for this highly irregular appearance." Detective James stepped forward with the calm authority of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. His voice was deep and steady. "Your Honor, my name is Detective James, and I serve with the Portland Police Department's K-9 unit. I've been in law enforcement for 32 years. This is Duke, a German shepherd specially trained and certified in trauma-informed victim advocacy. For the past 6 weeks, I've been working with Dr. Rachel, a pediatric trauma psychologist, reviewing the case file in this matter." Sarah's heart began to race. 6 weeks. Who had contacted him? How did he even know about Emma's case? "During my review," Detective continued, "I observed behavioral patterns and documentation that raised serious concerns. patterns I've seen hundreds of times in cases involving child abuse and trauma. I requested permission from the court administration to bring Duke as a certified emotional support animal to facilitate truthful communication from the minor. This request was reviewed and approved by the district court administrator this morning. Was sputtering, his face now the color of an overripe tomato. Your Honor, this is a setup, a clear attempt to manipulate and prejudice this proceedings. My client hasn't been given proper notice of this witness or this dog. The notification was provided to counsel yesterday at 6 p.m. via certified email, detective said calmly, producing a printed confirmation of delivery. The court also sent formal documentation of Duke's certifications, training records, and previous successful case outcomes. Judge held up his hand. I did receive notification from the court administrator this morning. I'll admit I was skeptical, but detective is well known to this court. He's in numerous cases. His credentials are impeccable. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying the detective and the dog with newfound interest. However, I need to understand the basis for your concerns about this case. What specifically prompted your involvement? Detective took a breath. Your Honor, when I reviewed the case file, I noticed several critical details. The minor has been in her father's sole or primary custody for 18 months. During that time, there have been 5 hospital admissions for injuries reported as accidental. That's nearly 3 times the national average for childhood accidental injuries. Additionally, there were documented behavioral changes noted by her preschool teacher: anxiety, withdrawal, hypervigilance. These are classic indicators of trauma exposure. Sarah felt tears beginning to stream down her face. Someone had finally listened. Someone had finally cared enough to investigate. Furthermore, detective continued, in cases involving child abuse, we found that young children, particularly those who are afraid or who've been told not to speak, often can't articulate their experiences verbally, but they respond to animals, dogs in particular. The unconditional nature of canine presence can unlock emotional truth in ways that traditional questioning cannot. Duke is trained specifically for this purpose. David's lawyer was on his feet again, but Judge silenced him with a stern look. I'll allow this, but detective, I want this done carefully and with proper documentation. We proceed with appropriate clinical oversight. Agreed. Absolutely, Your Honor, detective said. Dr. Rachel will be directing the process. All communication will be recorded. Everything will follow proper protocol. As detective walked Duke into position near the witness box, Sarah watched David's confident demeanor crack just slightly. His lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear. David's jaw clenched, and for the first time since these proceedings began, the predator looked uncertain. The hunter suddenly realized he might be the hunted. The courtroom fell silent, charged with electricity and possibility. Everyone sensed that something momentous was about to happen. Emma looked confused, her eyes fixed on the massive dog approaching her position. Sarah held her breath and prayed like she'd never prayed before. Everything was about to change. Emma Mitchell was brought into the courtroom by a court-appointed bailiff, a kind-faced woman named who worked specifically with children in legal proceedings. Emma wore the pink dress Sarah had chosen, the one with the white lace collar that made her look impossibly small and fragile. She clutched a worn stuffed bunny to her chest, its fur matted from countless nights of being held for comfort. The bunny had been a gift from Sarah on Emma's 2nd birthday, and it was the only thing the child had consistently asked for when she had to leave her mother's house. Emma's entire body was rigid with anxiety. Her eyes darted around the courtroom like a frightened animal searching for an escape route. The high ceiling seemed impossibly vast to a 3-year-old. The heavy wooden furniture loomed like obstacles in a dark forest. The voices, serious, authoritative, sometimes angry, created an atmosphere of tension that even a young child could sense and absorb. Emma's thumb immediately went into her mouth, and she pressed herself against leg, trying to make herself smaller, more invisible. Sarah's heart shattered watching her daughter in such distress. She wanted to scoop Emma into her arms and run from this place, away from judges and lawyers and custody battles, and all the machinery of a broken system that treated children like property instead of precious human beings. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her fingernails drew blood from her own palms. David sat motionless, his expression carefully neutral. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something. Whatever was said, David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was worried. For the first time in this entire proceeding, the confident predator looked uncertain. Detective gently guided Duke to a position roughly 15 feet from where Emma stood. He didn't move the dog closer. He understood that pushing a traumatized child too quickly would only reinforce her defenses. Duke understood something fundamental that most humans missed. Fear needs to be approached with patience, not force. The dog settled into a calm sitting position, his massive frame perfectly still, his intelligent eyes focused directly on Emma. Everything happened in the span of a few seconds, but to everyone watching, it felt like the world was shifting on its axis. Emma looked toward the dog. Her eyes widened. Her body went completely rigid. For a moment, absolutely nothing moved, not her breathing, not her trembling fingers, not even her eyes. She was frozen in a state of profound recognition that transcended words or logic. It was as if something ancient and primal within her had recognized a kindred spirit, a protector, something safe in this terrifying landscape of hostile adults and institutional cruelty. Then slowly, Emma's thumb slipped from her mouth. Her breathing changed, became quicker, shallower, almost panicked, but not from fear, from something else entirely. Hope, recognition, a drowning person seeing land for the first time in months. Emma took one small step toward Duke, then another, reached down to hold her hand, but Emma was fixated, her small feet moving with purpose toward the massive dog. David's lawyer grabbed David's arm and whispered urgently, but David couldn't look away from what was unfolding. The entire courtroom had gone completely silent. Every person present, judge, bailiff, court reporter, the few spectators in the gallery, understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't trained performance. This wasn't choreographed drama. This was raw, authentic connection between a traumatized child and an animal that understood trauma in ways humans often couldn't. Duke didn't move toward Emma. He waited. His breathing remained steady and calm. His eyes never wavered from hers. It was an impatience. The dog somehow knowing that Emma needed to choose this connection, needed to claim agency in her own healing, needed to approach safety on her own terms. Emma covered the distance in what felt like an eternity and a second simultaneously. She was trembling now, her entire small frame shaking with emotion she couldn't name or understand. Tears had begun streaming down her round cheeks, but her eyes never left Duke's face. It was as if she was searching for something in the dog's expression, confirmation, safety, truth, love, all the things she'd been. When Emma was close enough, Duke, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a large, powerful animal, lowered his massive head. His face came down to Emma's level. His warm, dark eyes met hers. And then, with deliberate care, Duke pressed his forehead against Emma's small chest, directly over her heart. Emma's arms came up and wrapped around Duke's thick neck. Her small hands buried themselves in his dense fur. She made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something primal and ancient that came from the deepest part of a child's wounded soul. It was the sound of finally finding safety, of finally being understood, of finally being held by something that wouldn't hurt her. Sarah felt her body convulse with sobs she could barely contain. Tears poured down her face, and she had to press her hand over her mouth to stifle the sounds threatening to escape. Emma was safe. Even if just for this moment, even if just here in this courtroom, her daughter was finally safe. Judge removed his reading glasses and set them slowly on the bench. His expression had transformed completely. The bureaucratic indifference had vanished, replaced by something raw and human. He watched the 3-year-old girl holding onto the police dog as if he were the last thing keeping her tethered to earth. Detective stood quietly, his own eyes glistening with moisture. He'd done this dozens of times, brought Duke into rooms where children were afraid, but the power of the moment never diminished. Every single time, he was reminded why he dedicated his career to giving voiceless children a way to speak their truth. Emma remained pressed against Duke for what seemed like an eternity. The dog's calm presence was like a balm to her wounded spirit. His unconditional acceptance of her pain, his complete non-judgment, his patient understanding, all of it worked together to create something magical, something healing, something that opened a door Emma didn't even know she'd closed. After several minutes, Emma pulled back slightly but kept one small hand buried in Duke's fur. She looked around the courtroom and her gaze landed on her mother. For the first time in 18 months of this custody battle, Emma's expression was clear and present and aware. The fog of trauma lifted just enough for recognition. Sarah, despite the tears streaming down her face, smiled at her daughter. Emma's lip trembled and she mouthed a single word: "Mommy." Dr. Rachel, the pediatric trauma psychologist, approached slowly and sat down on the courtroom floor at Emma's level. She was a small woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray streaking through her dark hair. She'd done this countless times, the delicate work of helping traumatized children find their voices. But she always did it with reverence and respect, understanding that she was witnessing something sacred. "Hi, Emma," Doctor said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Duke. He's very special. He helps children feel brave." Emma nodded without speaking, her hand still clutching Duke's fur. "Emma, I want to ask you some questions about your house, okay? About who lives there with you." Emma's body went slightly tense, but her grip on Duke's fur tightened. The dog remained perfectly still, his presence a silent guarantee of safety. "It's okay," Doctor continued gently. "Duke is right here. He'll help you be brave." Emma looked up at the psychologist, then back at Duke. She took a deep breath, her small chin set with determination. She was ready. For the first time, with Duke as her witness and protector, Emma was ready to speak her truth. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for the two words that would change everything forever. The courtroom had transformed into something ethereal and suspended, a space where time seemed to move differently. Every person present held their breath, understanding on some intuitive level that they were about to witness something that would reshape reality. Dr. Rachel remained seated on the cold courthouse floor, her presence deliberately unthreatening, her body language a mirror of calm acceptance. She represented safety. She represented the possibility of being heard. "Emma," Doctor began, her voice so soft it was barely audible over the hum of the building's ventilation system. "I know you're very smart and very brave. I can see that just by looking at you. Can you tell me about where you live? Who lives in your house?" Emma's small fingers continued their anxious manipulation of Duke's thick fur. The dog's coat had become a lifeline, something tangible to hold onto while navigating the terrifying terrain of speaking about things she'd been taught never to discuss. Her eyes darted toward David, and Detective noticed the flash of fear that crossed her face. That single instinctive reaction told him everything he needed to know. The child's body remembered danger. "It's okay, sweetheart," Doctor said gently, noticing the same thing. "Duke is right here, and I'm right here. You're safe. You can tell me anything." Emma's thumb crept back toward her mouth, a regressive behavior that trauma specialists knew intimately. Children under stress often reverted to earlier developmental stages: thumb sucking, baby talk, regression in potty training. Emma's body was literally reverting to infancy, seeking the comfort of a younger, simpler time when she still had some illusion of safety. "Who makes breakfast for you?" Doctor asked, trying a safer entry point, a question about daily routine rather than trauma. "Who takes care of you?" Emma remained silent, her eyes fixed on Duke. The dog's steady presence seemed to be her anchor to this moment, her guarantee that she wouldn't be abandoned or hurt for speaking. Seconds ticked by. The silence stretched like taffy, becoming almost unbearable. In the gallery, Sarah's friend squeezed her hand so tightly it hurt. Everyone present understood they were at a threshold. Either Emma would find her voice, or the weight of fear and conditioning would silence her again. David's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. The child is clearly too traumatized to provide reliable testimony. I move that we end this circus immediately and proceed to your ruling based on the evidence already presented." Judge's gaze swept to the lawyer with such intensity that the man actually took a step backward. "Counsel, sit down, now." There was steel in the judge's voice, the steel of a man who had just witnessed the transformation of his own consciousness. He'd come into this courtroom prepared to make a predetermined ruling, but something had cracked open in him watching that 3-year-old girl find the courage to approach the dog. He'd seen the visceral, undeniable reality of trauma written across a child's face. He'd seen the extraordinary power of one creature simply being present for another. Doctor continued as if the interruption hadn't occurred. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm going to ask you some questions and you can answer any way you want to. You can use words, or you can point, or you can just nod your head. Okay?" Emma nodded so slightly, it was almost imperceptible. "Does Daddy live in your house?" Emma nodded again. Her entire body had gone rigid, as if she was bracing for impact. "Does Mommy live in your house?" Emma shook her head vigorously. Then her lower lip began to quiver. "That's okay," Doctor said, her voice dripping with compassion. "Emma, I want to ask you something important. I want you to look at Duke while you think about your answer, okay? Duke helps children tell the truth. Duke loves children, and Duke will help keep you safe." Emma's gaze shifted to Duke's face. The dog seemed to understand his role with perfect intuition. His brown eyes softened, and his head tilted slightly toward Emma in a gesture that somehow communicated, "I'm here. I believe you. I will witness your truth." "Emma," Doctor asked, her voice dropping even lower, "does anyone at your house ever hurt you?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade, suspended above the assembled crowd. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Every person present understood they were about to hear something that would either confirm their worst fears or shatter the credibility of the abuse allegations entirely. Emma's entire body began to shake. Not subtle trembling, but violent, convulsive shaking that seemed to come from her core. Her hand, still buried in Duke's fur, gripped harder. Sarah watched her daughter and felt her own heart fragmenting into 1,000 pieces. That shaking, that was the physical manifestation of terror. That was a child's body remembering pain. "It's okay, Emma," Doctor whispered. "You're safe. Duke is here. I'm here. Just tell me the truth." Emma opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound emerged. The conditioning had been too thorough, the fear too profound. The weight of 18 months of being told not to speak, not to tell Mommy, not to complain, it was crushing her small voice before it could even form. Sarah felt something break inside her. Her daughter couldn't speak. The trauma had stolen Emma's voice entirely. But then something extraordinary happened. Emma looked at Duke with an intensity that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old child. Her hand released its grip on the dog's fur and came up to point directly across the courtroom, directly at David Mitchell. Her arm shook violently. Her entire body convulsed with the effort of this single act of rebellion against everything she'd been taught. And then, in a voice so clear it seemed to cut through every wall, every defense, every lie that had been constructed in that courtroom, Emma spoke 2 words that would echo through everyone's lives forever. "Daddy hurts." The impact was seismic. Sarah's scream was involuntary and piercing, a sound of anguish and vindication and horror all compressed into a single wail. Her body convulsed, and she half rose from her chair before her attorney pulled her back down. Tears poured down her face so violently it looked like her body was melting. David's lawyer jumped up, screaming objections. This is inadmissible. The child is being coached. This entire proceeding is tainted. I demand an immediate mistrial." But David himself had gone completely white. His face had drained of all color until he looked like a corpse sitting upright in an expensive suit. His hands gripped the edge of the table with such force that the wood creaked. His eyes were locked on Emma with an expression of such shock and rage that the bailiffs immediately moved closer, sensing danger. "Order, order!" Judge's gavel came down repeatedly, each strike like thunder in a suddenly electric atmosphere. "Everyone sit down, now." The courtroom descended into controlled chaos. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every word. The bailiffs moved to positions closer to David. Detective stepped forward, his body a protective barrier between Emma and everyone else in the room. Emma, having expelled those 2 words, collapsed against Duke like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The dog, responding with perfect instinct, curved his massive body around the child, creating a protective barrier. His warm fur became a fortress. His steady heartbeat became a lullaby for a child who'd just done the bravest thing of her young life. Doctor quietly said, "You did so good, Emma. You're so brave, so brave." Judge removed his glasses and set them on the bench with deliberate slowness. His eyes were glistening with moisture. When he looked at David Mitchell, there was no judgment or mercy in his gaze, only the cold, clear recognition of truth. In those 2 words, everything had changed. The narrative had inverted. The predator had been exposed. Judge's voice, when he finally spoke, sounded like it was coming from somewhere very deep and very human. "We are taking a mandatory 30-minute recess. Court-ordered custody evaluation will be immediately implemented. Detective, this child will require emergency medical assessment. I want documentation of every injury, past and present. Child Protective Services is being contacted immediately. We will reconvene in 30 minutes. The gavel came down one final time, and the world tilted on its axis. The emergency room at Portland Children's Hospital transformed into ground zero for what would become one of the most meticulously documented child abuse cases in Oregon history. Doctor, a pediatrician specializing in child trauma and abuse assessment, examined Emma with the care of someone handling the most precious artifact in the world. Detective stood in the observation room with Sarah, watching through one-way glass as the doctor gently, methodically documented evidence of systematic abuse. What emerged over the next 72 hours would horrify everyone involved. The initial medical examination revealed injuries at multiple stages of healing, a roadmap of repeated trauma etched across a child's small, defenseless body. Emma had 3 healing fractures, a hairline fracture on her left radius forearm that was approximately 8 weeks old, a fracture on her third rib that was roughly 4 weeks old, and a fracture on her left tibia shin bone that appeared to be only 2 weeks old. Doctor photographed each injury with professional precision, her face growing grimmer with each click of the camera. "These injuries are inconsistent with simple accidents," Doctor explained to the assembled team of medical professionals, detectives, and CPS workers. "The pattern suggests intentional, repetitive trauma. The various stages of healing indicate this has occurred multiple times over an extended period." But the fractures were only the beginning. Emma's small body bore the unmistakable signatures of physical abuse. Defensive bruises marked her tiny arms, the kind of bruising that occurs when a child raises their arms to protect their face from incoming blows. There were finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms, consistent with someone gripping her violently. Circular bruises on her back suggested impacts with rounded objects or being struck repeatedly. Most damning were the bruises on her inner thighs and buttocks, injuries that pediatric trauma specialists knew were almost always inflicted deliberately, never accidental. A pediatric psychologist interviewed Emma over the course of several hours, using dolls and drawings to help the child communicate her experiences. Emma, her voice barely audible, described being spanked really hard, being thrown, being shaken when Daddy got mad. The psychologist documented signs of severe post-traumatic stress, hypervigilance, flinching at sudden movements, dissociation, regression to infantile behaviors. Emma's trauma profile matched textbook child abuse patterns with terrifying precision. Meanwhile, detective and his team executed search warrants for David's house. What they found made even hardened law enforcement officers' stomachs turn. In the master bedroom, they discovered a leather belt with visible wear marks on the end, the kind of wear that comes from repeated impact with flesh. In the kitchen, they found a wooden spoon with a hairline fracture consistent with repeated striking force. In the garage, they discovered a jump rope with markings suggesting it had been used as a striking implement. David had essentially left a toolkit of abuse lying around his house, never imagining someone would examine it as evidence. Hospital records painted a chilling picture when analyzed forensically. David had brought Emma to the emergency room 4 times in 6 months, far exceeding normal pediatric injury rates. Each visit had been documented with a convenient accident story. Fell off the couch, tripped on the stairs, hit her head on the furniture, accident in the bathroom. Each story was different. Each story was suspicious. Cross-referencing the dates and timestamps with David's custody schedule revealed a damning pattern. Every injury corresponded with a period when Emma was in David's sole care. No injuries occurred during Sarah's visitation weekends. The preschool teacher, Miss Jennifer, came forward with information that had been gnawing at her conscience for months. She'd noticed Emma displaying what she described as fear-based behaviors whenever another child raised their voice or moved suddenly. One day, several weeks earlier, Emma had shown her bruises on her arm and whispered, "Daddy says Mommy's the bad person. I can't tell Mommy. Daddy says Mommy will hurt me too." Miss had reported the incident to her supervisor, but in the chaos of preschool administration, the report had been filed and forgotten, a bureaucratic failure that nearly cost Emma her life. Neighbors began coming forward with their own accounts. Mrs. Helen, who lived next door to David's house, reported hearing Emma crying late at night, not the normal crying of a tired child, but the gut-wrenching wails of a child in profound distress. She'd heard David's voice raised in anger, followed by the sounds of a child screaming. Mrs. had hesitated to get involved, not wanting to interfere, but guilt had finally compelled her to speak to police. Another neighbor, Mr. James, reported witnessing David carrying Emma into the house while she was visibly struggling and crying. "He was dragging her," Mr. explained to detectives. "Her little feet were kicking and she was reaching toward the car like she didn't want to go inside. It was disturbing." Of David's, a man named who worked in the same law firm came forward anonymously through a secure tip line. His account was the most damning yet. Reported witnessing David lose his temper during a casual office gathering where children had been invited. Emma had spilled juice on the carpet and David's response had been shockingly disproportionate. "He grabbed her by the arm really roughly," recounted. "He was shaking her while he yelled at her. I mean really shaking her, like violently. It was scary." Everyone saw it. Everyone was shocked by how aggressive he was. Later, he tried to pass it off as just being strict about discipline, but it was way beyond that. It was scary to watch, and she's just a little kid. Security footage obtained from a neighbor's Ring doorbell camera provided video evidence that corroborated Emma's testimony and witness accounts. The footage, timestamped and dated, showed David on multiple occasions carrying a struggling, crying Emma into his house. In one particularly disturbing sequence, Emma could be seen reaching back toward the car while David pulled her forward, her small mouth open in what appeared to be a cry for help. Text messages between David and his new girlfriend, obtained through a warrant, revealed conversations that made even the prosecutor's hands shake. David had written, "Emma's being a little nightmare today, won't listen, needs real discipline, the kind her mother never gave her." His girlfriend had responded, "Maybe she just needs a firmer hand." David's subsequent message was chilling, "That's what I've been giving her." Hospital staff reviewed previous admissions and discovered that David had consistently told different stories about each injury to different physicians. He'd told one doctor Emma fell off the couch, but told another that she tripped on the stairs. This variation in accident narratives is a classic indicator of fabricated stories. Liars often can't keep their false narratives consistent. A forensic psychologist specializing in child interviews reviewed the video recordings of Emma's initial statements to doctor. Her analysis was definitive. This child exhibits zero indicators of coaching or false reporting. Her trauma responses are authentic and consistent with chronic abuse exposure. Her statements, while simple, contain specific details about her physical experiences that a 3-year-old could not fabricate. The emotional authenticity is unmistakable. The evidence accumulated like an avalanche, each piece individually damning, but collectively creating an undeniable mountain of proof. David had made a critical mistake in his arrogance. He'd assumed no one would believe a 3-year-old. He'd assumed his expensive lawyer, his respectable appearance, and his carefully constructed narrative would be enough to overcome a child's whispered testimony. He'd underestimated the power of truth spoken by someone pure and innocent and desperate to be heard. Detective compiled all the evidence into a comprehensive report that ran to 247 pages. Photographs, medical records, witness statements, text messages, security footage, forensic analysis, everything meticulously documented and cross-referenced. By the time the investigation concluded, there were literally dozens of pieces of corroborating evidence, each one independently damning, all of them together creating an airtight case. The prosecutor reviewed the file and said simply, "This is one of the clearest abuse cases I've ever seen. There's no ambiguity here, no reasonable doubt, just systematic, deliberate cruelty to a defenseless child." David Mitchell's world had imploded, crushed under the weight of evidence and truth, and a 3-year-old girl's courage to speak 2 simple words. The interrogation room at the Portland Police Department was deliberately designed to be psychologically uncomfortable. Harsh fluorescent lighting, cold metal table, uncomfortable chairs, walls painted institutional gray. It was here, 72 hours after Emma's 2 words shattered his world, that David Mitchell began to comprehend the magnitude of his catastrophe. David sat across from detective and assistant district attorney. His previously immaculate appearance had deteriorated significantly. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His hair, usually slicked back with meticulous precision, hung limp and disheveled. Most telling were his eyes, the eyes of a man watching his entire existence collapse in real time. His hands trembled as they lay on the metal table, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. His lawyer, Richard, sat beside him, his predatory confidence completely eviscerated, had reviewed the evidence, all 247 pages of it, and the reality had struck him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a case of he said, she said. This wasn't a situation where a mother's accusations could be painted as the bitter revenge of a vindictive ex-wife. The evidence was forensic, medical, witnessed, photographed, videotaped, and documented with the kind of precision that made courtroom defense virtually impossible. "Mr. Mitchell," detective began, his voice steady and professional, "we've compiled comprehensive evidence regarding the injuries sustained by your daughter, Emma Mitchell, over the past 18 months. I'm going to review this evidence with you, and then we're going to discuss your options. Do you understand?" David nodded mutely, his throat visibly working as he swallowed hard. Methodically laid out the case like a prosecutor preparing for trial, X-rays showing 3 fractures at different healing stages, photographs of Emma's bruised, marked body, each image a silent scream of a child suffering, medical reports from doctor documenting injuries inconsistent with accidents, the security footage showing Emma struggling as David pulled her into his house, the text messages between David and his girlfriend, the witness statements from neighbors and preschool staff. With each piece of evidence, David's face grew paler. His hands, which had been trembling, now shook so violently that reached over and squeezed his arm, a gesture that seemed more restraining than supportive. The evidence, continued, includes testimony from medical professionals, law enforcement personnel, civilians, and most importantly, your 3-year-old daughter. A child, Mr. Mitchell, who despite her fear, despite her conditioning, despite everything you taught her about not speaking to her mother, found the courage to tell the truth. David made a strangled sound, something between a gasp and a sob. He bent forward, his elbows on the table, his head in his hands. His entire body convulsed with what appeared to be a combination of rage, despair, and the crushing weight of reality finally settling upon him. "You realize," Ada said, her voice carrying the weight of professional judgment, "that we have enough evidence to proceed with charges of child abuse, aggravated assault of a minor, reckless endangerment, and potentially attempted obstruction of justice, given the false reports you filed with hospitals about accidents. Given the preponderance of evidence, a jury would convict you on all counts. You understand that?" David didn't respond immediately. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and glistening with tears. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of a predator realizing he'd been caught. There was a desperate quality to his gaze, like a cornered animal searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Leaned close and whispered urgently in David's ear. David's jaw clenched as his lawyer spoke. The conversation lasted perhaps 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes represented the death of David's legal defense strategy. Was a pragmatist. He understood that proceeding to trial with this evidence would be not just losing, but losing catastrophically. A jury would see the photographs of Emma's bruised body. They would watch the security footage. They would hear the testimony. They would see a 3-year-old child who'd been systematically brutalized by the person who was supposed to protect her. The jury would not just convict, they would despise him. The sentence would be severe. "My client wishes to make a statement," finally said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, reduced to mere professional formality. David took a shaking breath. His hands gripped the edge of the metal table so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse and broken. "I want to change my plea," he said. The words hung in the interrogation room like a death knell. "To what?" Detective asked, though he already knew the answer. "Guilty," David said. Then, as if the word had opened a floodgate, he continued, "I'm guilty to all of it. The abuse, the injuries, all of it. I did it. I hurt her. I hurt my daughter." The admission, once started, seemed to pour out of him in a broken torrent. He described incidents in disjointed, fragmented sentences. Moments when Emma had cried and he'd lost his temper. Times when she'd disobeyed and he'd responded with disproportionate physical punishment. Occasions when he'd been angry about Sarah, about the custody battle, about feeling like his daughter was being poisoned against him by her mother. And he'd taken that anger out on a 3-year-old child who had no capacity to understand or defend herself. "I told her not to tell Mommy," David admitted, his voice hollow. "I told her Mommy would hurt her worse. I told her it was normal. I made her keep secrets. I made her scared. I did that." Ada recorded the entire confession with clinical precision. This was exactly what she needed. Not just physical evidence, but David's own words, his own admission of guilt. It made the prosecution's case bulletproof. As David continued his confession, his mother, who was sitting in the observation room, broke down sobbing. She'd wanted to believe her son. She'd wanted to believe that Sarah was the liar, that there had been some misunderstanding. But the evidence was undeniable. The confession was undeniable. Her son had become a monster. The realization shattered something fundamental in her. By the time the interrogation concluded, David had admitted to every major element of the charges against him. He described the abuse in enough specific detail that there was zero possibility of this being a false confession. He understood the gravity of what he'd done. He was broken, but he was admitting the truth. 3 days later, In a hastily arranged court proceeding, David Mitchell stood before judge and formally entered a guilty plea to aggravated child abuse, 3 counts, reckless endangerment of a child, second-degree assault of a minor, child endangerment. The plea agreement called for a mandatory minimum sentence of 8 years in prison with the possibility of additional years at judicial discretion. He would be required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. He would be required to pay substantial restitution. Upon release, he would be permanently registered as a child offender. He would never have unsupervised contact with Emma again. When the judge asked David if he understood the consequences of his plea, David simply nodded. There were no more tears, no more protestations of innocence, no more carefully constructed legal strategies. There was only the hollow acknowledgement of a man who had finally been forced to confront the reality of what he'd become. Sarah, sitting in the gallery, watched the man she'd once married, the man she'd shared a life with, the man she'd given a child to, accept responsibility for his crimes against that child. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only a deep, aching sadness for Emma, for what her daughter had endured, for the trauma that would follow her for the rest of her life. But there was also something else, gratitude. Gratitude that her daughter's voice, when finally heard, had been enough. That 2 simple words, "Daddy hurts," had been sufficient to pierce through all the lies and legal maneuvering and bring truth into the light. As the bailiff led David away to custody, he looked back at Sarah for just a moment. In that moment, Sarah saw not the predator, not the abuser, but a broken man finally facing the consequences of his own monstrosity. She felt nothing, no pity, no anger, just emptiness where emotion used to be. Emma, waiting in a separate room with a victim advocate, didn't see any of this. She was coloring with crayons, trying to process the incomprehensible adult world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. But she would grow up knowing one crucial thing, that when she spoke the truth, even as a 3-year-old, even through her fear, the world listened. The world protected her. The world held the predator accountable. That knowledge, more than anything else, would become the foundation of her healing. The courtroom on sentencing day felt fundamentally different from the hearing where Emma had spoken her 2 life-altering words. Where before there had been tension and uncertainty, now there was the heavy, unmistakable weight of justice about to be dispensed. The gallery was packed, not with David's family, but with people who'd come to bear witness to the protection of a child. Mrs. Helen, the neighbor who'd heard Emma's screams. Miss Jennifer, the preschool teacher. The detective, and Duke, the dog who'd been the instrument of Emma's liberation. Reporters lined the back wall, prepared to document what many already understood would be a significant verdict. Sarah sat in the front row, her mother beside her, gripping her hand so tightly it hurt. She dressed carefully for this day, not in the desperate, frayed manner she'd worn to earlier hearings, but with quiet dignity. She wore a navy dress and had pinned her hair back neatly. She looked like a woman who'd survived something catastrophic and had emerged, battered but unbroken, on the other side. Emma wasn't present for the sentencing, a mercy the court had granted. A 3-year-old had no need to watch her father receive his punishment. Instead, Emma was with a victim advocate in a nearby room, coloring and playing, shielded from the machinery of justice that had been set in motion by her courage. David was led into the courtroom in shackles, a detail that made several people in the gallery gasp quietly. He looked diminished, reduced, less like the confident predator who'd once dominated these proceedings and more like a broken shell of a human being. His expensive suit had been replaced with jail clothing. His carefully maintained appearance had deteriorated into something approximating despair. He didn't meet anyone's eyes as he was led to the defense table. Judge Harold entered with the gravity of someone about to deliver judgment that would reshape multiple lives. He took his position on the bench and looked out at the assembled courtroom with an expression of profound sadness mixed with steely determination. This court has reviewed the comprehensive evidence in the case of State of Oregon v. David Robert Mitchell, the judge began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent courtroom. The defendant has entered guilty pleas to multiple counts of aggravated child abuse, reckless endangerment of a minor, and second-degree assault. The facts of this case are among the most disturbing this court has encountered in 37 years on the bench. Judge paused, and in that pause, the weight of what he was about to say seemed to settle over the courtroom like a heavy fog. A child, a 3-year-old girl, was subjected to systematic, deliberate physical abuse by the person who was supposed to be her protector, the judge continued. That child suffered multiple fractures at various stages of healing. That child bore the marks of repeated striking, grabbing, and violence. That child was conditioned through fear and manipulation not to speak about her suffering. And yet, when given the opportunity, when presented with a safe presence in the form of a trained police dog, that child found the courage to speak 2 words that began the process of justice. The judge looked directly at David. The defendant believed he could hide his crimes behind legal maneuvering and the assumption that no one would believe a 3-year-old child. He was catastrophically wrong. The evidence in this case is overwhelming and unambiguous. Judge opened the sentencing document before him. It is the judgment of this court that the defendant, David Robert Mitchell, is hereby sentenced to a minimum of 10 years in the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 8 years. A collective exhalation seemed to move through the courtroom. 10 years. The minimum was higher than the plea agreement had suggested. Judge had exercised judicial discretion to impose additional years beyond the negotiated minimum. Furthermore, the judge continued, upon release from incarceration, the defendant will be required to register as a child offender for the remainder of his natural life. He will undergo mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment while incarcerated. He will be ordered to pay restitution to the victim in the amount of $50,000, to be held in a victim's compensation fund for the minor's therapeutic and educational needs. He will never be granted unsupervised contact with the victim. Any violation of these conditions will result in immediate return to incarceration. Judge set down the sentencing document and looked directly at David. You preyed upon the most vulnerable member of our society, a child who could not defend herself, who had no voice in your household, who depended on you for protection. Instead of protection, you provided systematic cruelty. That child's bravery in speaking the truth, despite her fear, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Your deliberate attempt to silence her through fear and manipulation failed. And it is this court's sincere hope that you will spend your years in incarceration, contemplating the magnitude of the harm you caused. The judge's gaze swept to Sarah. The court has awarded full custody of Emma Mitchell to her mother, Sarah Mitchell, with a permanent protective order prohibiting any contact between the defendant and the minor. This child will have the opportunity to heal, to grow, and to understand that speaking the truth, no matter how frightening, can bring about justice and protection. The gavel came down with earth-shattering finality. For a moment, absolute silence held the courtroom. Then Sarah's body seemed to collapse into itself. Her mother pulled her into an embrace, and both women began to cry, not tears of sadness, but tears of liberation, of vindication, of a mother finally reclaiming her child from the machinery of a system that had temporarily failed them both. The courtroom erupted in a controlled but unmistakable emotion. Detective placed his hand on Duke's head, the dog seeming to understand the significance of the moment. The neighbor Mrs. wept quietly. The preschool teacher dabbed her eyes with tissues. The nodded, as if confirming that justice, finally, had been served. As bailiffs led David away to begin his sentence, he made eye contact with Sarah for just a moment. In that moment, something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer the predator, he was the condemned. She was no longer the desperate mother fighting a rigged system. She was the victor, the protector, the one who had been vindicated by truth. 30 minutes later, Emma was brought into the courtroom for a brief moment. Sarah scooped her daughter into her arms and held her so tightly it seemed impossible they could ever be separated again. Emma, confused by the intensity of her mother's emotion, patted Sarah's face and asked, "Mommy sad?" "No, baby," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy is happy, so happy you're safe now. You're going to stay with Mommy forever. You're safe." Emma looked around the courtroom and her gaze landed on Duke, who was sitting quietly beside Detective. The dog's tail began to wag slowly. Emma reached toward the dog and Detective gently guided Duke forward. Emma wrapped her small arms around Duke's neck, and the dog, with perfect understanding, rested his massive head on the child's shoulder. Detective approached Sarah, and the two embraced without words. No words were necessary. In this moment, three people, a mother, a child, and a detective who'd believed when belief was scarce, had been forged into something unbreakable by the experience of fighting for truth. "She's going to need support," Detective said quietly to Sarah. "Trauma therapy, consistency, patience. But Emma has something incredibly powerful now that she didn't have before. She has her mother. She has safety. She has the knowledge that speaking the truth brings protection." Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Outside the courtroom, reporters surged forward with cameras and microphones, but a phalanx of court officers and detective created a protective barrier. Sarah walked quickly, Emma in her arms, toward the exit. As they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Emma blinked against the brightness and looked up at her mother. "Go home, Mommy?" Emma asked. "Yes, baby," Sarah said, pressing her lips to the top of her daughter's head. "We're going home together, forever." For the first time in 18 months of nightmare, the false accusations, the custody battle, the desperate fight against a system that seemed designed to fail her, Sarah Mitchell felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not fragile, tentative hope, but solid, foundational hope built on the bedrock of truth, justice, and the incredible resilience of a 3-year-old girl who'd found her voice. Emma fell asleep on the drive home, her small hand clasped around her mother's. And Sarah, for the first time since the custody battle began, allowed herself to simply breathe. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served. And her daughter was finally, irrevocably safe. 3 years later, on a golden autumn afternoon, Emma Mitchell stood in front of a crowd of 200 people, her small hand clasped in her mother's, as a bronze plaque was unveiled at the Portland Children's Hospital. The plaque read, "Emma's Voice Foundation established 2026 dedicated to protecting children and ensuring their voices are heard." Below the text was an engraved image of a German shepherd's head and a child's silhouette reaching upward. Emma, now 6 years old, looked strikingly different from the traumatized toddler who'd clutched a dog's fur in a courtroom 3 years earlier. She was taller, stronger, with a brightness in her eyes that spoke of genuine healing rather than mere survival. She wore a purple dress, her favorite color, and her auburn hair, identical in shade to her mother's, was tied back with a ribbon. More importantly, she stood without fear. She smiled. She was present in her own life, in a way that would have been unimaginable during those dark months of abuse. Sarah Mitchell stood beside her daughter, her arm wrapped protectively around Emma's small shoulders. Sarah herself had transformed. She'd regained the weight she'd lost. Her skin had recovered its healthy glow, and her eyes, once hollowed by despair, now sparkled with purposeful determination. She'd become an advocate, a voice for other families trapped in similar nightmares, a warrior fighting for systemic change in how courts handled child abuse cases. The foundation that bore her daughter's name had already helped 247 families. Sarah had established protocols requiring K-9 officers' participation in sensitive child abuse cases. She'd worked with legal reform organizations to push for changes in how children's testimony was received in courtrooms. She'd created educational materials for teachers, social workers, and law enforcement about recognizing the signs of child abuse. materials that were now being used in training programs across Oregon and 3 other states. But the Foundation's most powerful work wasn't legislative or administrative, it was personal. Sarah conducted speaking engagements at universities and law enforcement conferences, sharing her story and Emma's story with audiences that ranged from 20 to 500 people. She'd been featured in documentary programs about child abuse and legal reform. Most importantly, she'd become a beacon of hope for other mothers fighting custody battles against abusers, proof that the system, however imperfect, could sometimes deliver justice when someone cared enough to push for truth. Emma had 3 years of trauma-informed therapy with Dr. Rachel, the same psychologist who'd guided her in that crucial courtroom moment. The therapy had involved art, play, and gradually processing the memories of abuse in a safe environment. Emma's nightmares, which had plagued her for the first 18 months after the sentencing, had gradually diminished. She still experienced occasional anxiety in situations that triggered memories, loud voices, sudden movements, but she developed coping mechanisms and emotional vocabulary to navigate her trauma. "Mommy," Emma had asked one evening, about 8 months after returning to her mother's full custody, "why did Daddy hurt me?" Sarah had taken a deep breath and chosen her words with the care of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "Sometimes, honey, people have things wrong inside their hearts and minds. They don't know how to handle their feelings, so they hurt people. But that wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve being hurt. You were just being a little girl." "Will he hurt me again?" Emma had asked, her small voice trembling. "No, baby," Sarah had promised. "He's in prison. That means he's in a special place where he can't hurt anyone. And I will always keep you safe. That's my job as your mommy." Emma had accepted this explanation in the way young children do, not fully understanding the complexities of the criminal justice system, but understanding the fundamental truth. She was protected now. Her mother would keep her safe. On the day of the Foundation's plaque unveiling, Detective James stood to the side with Duke, who was now 16 years old and moving with the careful deliberation of an elderly dog. Duke's muzzle had grayed, and his movements had slowed, but his eyes remained sharp and intelligent. The dog had become something of a local celebrity. His role in uncovering Emma's abuse had been documented in news stories, and people would often recognize him on the street. Detective had retired from active duty 2 years earlier, but remained consulting with the Portland Police Department on trauma-informed K-9 protocols. He trained a successor team, a younger detective and a German shepherd named Justice, to carry forward the work that Duke had pioneered. But Duke, in his retirement, remained the most powerful symbol of what one animal's unconditional presence could accomplish. Emma had asked if Duke could come to the Foundation unveiling. When Sarah had contacted Detective, he'd said simply, "I wouldn't miss it." And so Duke was there, receiving gentle pats from the crowd, his tail wagging slowly in that measured way of aging animals who learned wisdom through experience. The mayor spoke about the Foundation's impact. The hospital administrator discussed the protocols they'd implemented based on Emma's Voice Foundation recommendations. And then Sarah took the microphone. "3 years ago," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, "I stood in a courtroom desperate and broken, believing I might lose custody of my daughter to a man I knew in my soul was hurting her. I had documentation. I had instinct. But I didn't have what I needed most. I didn't have anyone listening." Sarah paused and the crowd fell silent. Then a detective believed. A dog showed up, and my daughter found her voice. Today, this foundation exists because I learned something crucial. Every voice matters. Every child deserves to be heard. And sometimes justice arrives in the most unexpected forms. Sarah looked down at Emma. "Emma, you are the bravest person I know. You spoke 2 words in a courtroom when you were terrified. Those 2 words, 'Daddy hurts,' didn't just change your life. They've changed the lives of 247 other families. They've prompted law enforcement to change how they approach child abuse cases. They've taught judges and lawyers and social workers that children's voices, when given a safe space to be heard, contain profound truth. Emma looked up at her mother, and in that moment the flash of cameras caught something perfect. A child who'd survived unspeakable trauma, looking at her mother with complete trust and love. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the speeches had ended, Emma sat on the front porch of their home with her mother, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. She held a small stuffed dog, a replica of Duke, that had been given to her by the foundation board. "Mommy," Emma said, "will other kids stop being hurt because of what I said?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Some kids will be protected because people listened to you and learned from what happened. That's beautiful, Emma. But some kids might still get hurt because there are people in the world who make bad choices. That's why we have to keep talking about it, keep teaching people, keep making sure that children are protected and listened to." "Like Detective and Duke did for me?" Emma asked. "Exactly like that," Sarah confirmed. "When we see something that's not right, we speak up, we help, we listen to the people who are scared and hurt." Emma nodded, satisfied with this explanation. She hugged her stuffed Duke to her chest and leaned against her mother's shoulder. In the following years, Emma grew into a resilient, compassionate child who understood, in ways most children never would, the fragility of safety and the power of speaking truth. She would eventually become an advocate herself, not because of trauma, but because she'd learned from her mother that one voice, amplified by others, could reshape the world. Sarah continued her work with the foundation, which eventually expanded to a national organization, helping child abuse victims navigate the legal system. She'd been interviewed by major news outlets, featured in documentaries, and recognized by child advocacy organizations. But the moment she was most proud of wasn't any of these professional achievements. It was the morning Emma woke up without nightmares for the first time in years. It was the day Emma laughed freely without the weight of fear. It was the ordinary, miraculous transformation of a traumatized child into a thriving one. Duke lived to age 18, spending his final years being visited by children at schools and community centers. Somehow, even in his extreme old age, the dog seemed to understand his purpose, to sit quietly with children and help them understand that the world contained gentleness and safety alongside its horrors. When he passed peacefully in his sleep, Detective wept. And Emma, now 10 years old, attended the memorial service and spoke about how a dog had saved her life. Emma grew up knowing her story, knowing that she'd survived the unsurvivable, knowing that her voice had power, knowing that sometimes the most profound victories come not from physical strength, but from the courage to speak truth when silence would be easier. She carried Duke's memory with her always, a four-legged guardian who'd understood that some children need an animal's unconditional love to finally feel safe enough to speak. And Sarah Mitchell, once a desperate mother fighting a rigged system, became a beacon of hope for countless other parents, proof that justice, though imperfect and often painful, could still prevail when someone cared enough to listen to a child's voice, especially when that voice belonged to someone as brave and as small as Emma. The end.